Greetings and welcome. Thank you for coming. I'm glad you could be here today. Before we get started, please take a moment to hit those like and subscribe buttons. And when it's all said and done, please go ahead and drop us a comment. It all helps feed the hungry algorithm and helps keep us going. Now, before going too much further, I'd like to take a moment to thank my Tier 4 Patreon patrons, Russ of the Frozen North, Neo5AC, and Nick. Thank you very much. Now, on with the story. Time and Tide. A story by The Casual Deathworlder. Chapter 2. Katai. I looked back to the harbor to search for Ata on his ship. As I did so, the full horror of what had just transpired crashed in on me. I keeled over, retching in sickness and frozen in horror. I don't know quite how I managed to keep my bowels in check. I was that scared. From somewhere off in another world, I could hear someone screaming my name. I turned numbly to the sound of the voice. "Get up!" Anaya screamed. "Maia! They're coming back! Get up!" It was difficult to make out his voice amid the screams of the wounded, but I managed to force myself to hear him. With some difficulty, I was able to stand up and stagger back over to him. My arms and legs felt like lead and didn't seem to want to respond. Looking over the water, I could see the pursuing ships had rejoined the rest of the incoming fleet and were now continuing in towards the wall. There were so many of them. 5, maybe 600 in all. Perhaps 30 or 40,000 men. This fleet had come with one purpose in mind: to destroy Katai. Another group of guards came down the wall with bags of arrows. My hands were trembling so bad I almost couldn't untie the bundles. My world turned into tunnel vision as I nocked an arrow, and my arms felt too weak to draw the bow. Just as I was beginning to stand to look for a target, an eye crashed into me, sending us both sprawling to the ground. An instant later there was a loud crash somewhere very near to where we had just been standing. Suddenly, everything snapped into focus. I was still terrified, but my mind was free of paralysis. I could think and move freely. And I was mad. That shot had almost killed Anai and me. "You all right?" Anai asked as he helped me back up. He looked around for a moment to find his bow. "Still breathing, if barely," I replied as I untangled myself from my bow. Anai's impact had knocked the wind out of me. I looked over the parapet again to see what appeared to be large rocks flying through the air. Many of the Atlantean ships were fitted with large crossbows, which could hurl a spear or other munitions over a quarter of a mile. We ducked again as the barrage came in. There was a series of loud crashes, followed by a low whoosh, and the parapet erupted in screams. Parts of the parapet were engulfed in flames. Anai, myself, and about a dozen others were trapped between two walls of fire, cut off from the rest of the defenders. Everywhere I looked, there were small groups cut off from each other, trying to find cover from the hell falling from the sky. More crashes announced the arrival of another barrage. Then the impacts became fairly constant. There were people running, screaming and writhing in agony in the midst of the flames, but my mind immediately pushed the image aside. My fear had given way to rage. Standing, I screamed obscenities at the enemy in all 7 languages that I knew. I saw that a large group of ships had rowed in under the cover of the barrage and were now well within bowshot. In my mind's eye, I could see my sister being raped by the sea reavers after having watched Amma being butchered in front of her. I knew that such would be their fate when this wall fell, and there were so few of us I didn't see how we could prevent that from happening. All I could do for them was to buy them some time. Every minute we could hold the enemy back was another minute for Amma and Amane to get to safety. Still screaming, I drew my arrow back to my eye, took aim, and released. I didn't wait to see how true my shot was. I just knew. Before the arrow reached its target, I had 2 more in the air. It was as if time had slowed down. Everything around me seemed to be going in slow motion, yet I could move at normal speed. I kept a steady stream of arrows going, having as many as 4 arrows in the air at one time, and I knew with certainty that nearly every arrow found its mark. Even in a fight for our lives, the competitive spirit was alive in Anai, and he tried to keep pace with me. And failed. We soon depleted our arrows and had to retrieve the bundles from the pair that had died next to us in the first engagement. Finally, the ships were in range of our catapults, and a hail of rocks and burning pitch was launched from the walls. 2 ships were set ablaze immediately, and several more damaged in the initial volley, and our crews began reloading and firing at a desperate pace. The rest of the defenders, still huddling against the arrow shelf, realized just how close the enemy ships were. Overcoming their fear of enemy fire, they popped up en masse and opened fire with terrifying accuracy. The defense of the city began in earnest. Utterly forsaking sanity, I climbed up onto the arrow shelf and continued shooting from there, screaming like a mad thing the whole time. Apparently, insanity is contagious, and insanity shared is what true friendship is made of. I don't even like to think of how many arrows missed Anai and me as we stood together on top of the arrow shelf and laid waste to the crew of the nearest ship. Firebombs struck the face of the wall to either side of us, but we didn't even flinch as we continued loosing arrow after arrow after arrow. We were invincible. We couldn't be touched. I had fired so many arrows my arms were beyond fatigued, and my fingers had started to bleed, but I was so far gone that I didn't even notice. I also didn't notice the voice screaming behind me. I looked up to see a large clay pot launch from one of the ships and sail straight for us. Just then, rough hands grabbed us both and pulled us to the ground, just as the pot sailed through the air right where we had just been standing. It shattered and ignited on the back edge of the parapet, spilling down the back of the wall.
"Loomis's teeth, girl, what in the name of the gods are you doing here?"
Atta screamed at me. Somehow he had made it up here through the bombardment. He looked almost haggard from his ordeal, and I had never seen him so angry in my life. In my madness, I just grinned and screamed back at him through the noise of the battle. "The same as you are! Ducking!"
"Damn it, Maya! This is no place for a child! Get your ass off this wall! Now!"
"No!" I screamed back at him, my anger momentarily finding another focus. "I would rather make my stand here than be raped with the other girls when this wall falls! I'm staying!" At that instant, there was a loud clink directly above us. We looked up to see a large hook locked to the lip of the arrow shelf. Another joined it momentarily. The ships had reached the wall.
"Damn it, Maya!"
Atta screamed once more. He reached to his belt and pulled out a long knife and handed it to me, then bent and pulled a sword from a fallen guard. He shoved it at Anai, growling threateningly.
"Guard her with your life!"
Pulling his own sword, he jumped up and began hacking at the scaling rope. I knocked an arrow and stood up looking for a target. The Imperial ships had pulled right up to the wall and were forming a raft 3 ships deep. Some of the ships were large enough that their masts were higher than the walls, and many nimble sailors were able to use their spar like a siege ramp. I had just started picking off men crossing on the nearest spar when it felt like my head suddenly exploded. A rock, probably from a sling, had grazed my head hard enough to knock me down. I cried and screamed for a few moments as the pain engulfed me, then managed to stagger back to my feet. The next couple of hours went by in kind of a nightmarish blur. I saw things and did things too horrible to describe here. I do remember at some point the Atlanteans made it onto the wall near us, only to be driven off again by a desperate counterattack. Atta had become death incarnate. I had never seen him fight before, and his prowess was terrifying to behold. He was truly without peer, and aside from my own abilities, I would not see his like again until I fell in love with a young Greek named Achilles many, many centuries later. By the end of the battle, I was back on top of the shelf, screaming my multilingual defiance at the enemy, hurling whatever Anai tossed me down onto the ships below. Rocks, weapons, body parts, anything he could find. The air was thick with smoke from burning oil and burning ships when the enemy pulled their surviving ships away from the wall and retreated out of range. While the fighting had been happening on the seawall, most of the rest of the Imperial fleet had begun landing at the beaches to the north side of the city. For the moment, the fighting was over. My screams ultimately trailed off, leaving a profound silence within the city. Still in a state of madness and shock, I slowly turned and looked around. The survivors on the wall were far beyond exhaustion, and it was difficult to tell the living from the dead. Ata and I and me were the only defenders still on their feet. Down in the harbor, several thousand people watched the wall in anticipation. Raising my arm above my head, a severed arm still clenched in my fist, I roared one last time, spun and hurled the arm down at the retreating ships. The city exploded in cheering. Sanity slowly returned, and with it the reality of all that had just occurred. I almost fell off the wall as my knees buckled beneath me. If it hadn't been for a quick grab by Ata, I would have fallen off the outside of the wall. The world swam in front of my eyes, and my bowels turned to water. There was no keeping them in check after that. I broke down into bouts of hysterical sobbing, between bouts of vomiting. It felt as though my body and my spirit were turning themselves inside out. When I finished throwing up, Ata sat me up against the wall. I could hear him talking to me as if from a great distance, asking if I was hurt and checking my wounds. I was covered in blood, both mine and others, and I must have looked like the victim of a massacre. Of course, there wasn't a person alive on the wall that didn't look just like me. Ata took my face in his blood-soaked hands and turned my head, forcing me to make eye contact with him.
Can you hear me, Maia?
He asked.
It's over. You are alive. Do you hear me, Maia? You are alive and whole. Come back to me, Maia. Come back to me.
He pulled me to him and held me for a long time as I cried myself out. Finally, there was a sound of someone retching next to us, and we looked over to see Anai on his knees being sick. Untangling myself from Ata, I crawled over to Anai and held him until he had physically and emotionally emptied himself.
Who is this boy?
Ata asked in a grim voice as he sat against the wall. This is my friend, I said through my tears as I held Anai. His name is Anai. We've been training together for months now.
He stayed with you through the entire battle,
Ata said.
He didn't run, though he should have. He stayed by your side the entire time, and he saved you several times. A truer friend you could not ask for.
Ata got up for a moment and came back with our weapons. Handing the sword to Anai and the knife to me, he said,
These are yours. Clean them.
Anai nodded numbly and began cleaning the sword with the shirt of a fallen attacker. Ata must have noticed Anai's wounds before I did, because he suddenly stripped off his shirt and started ripping it into strips and binding Anai's wounds. As Ata was treating him, Anai looked over the harbor and asked with a distant voice, Where is the king? Ata paused for a moment and buried his face in his hands. When he looked up again, there were tears in his eyes. He said in a breaking voice,
Dead. Iliak is dead.
It was the first time in my life that I had ever seen Ata cry, and his words shook the very foundations of my being. I crawled away for a moment and threw up again. It was too much to take, and my mind did the only thing it could to protect itself. It shut down. After a bit, I heard Ata ask Anai if he could walk as he helped me to my feet. I was totally numb as Ata draped my arm over Anai's shoulders and told him to take me home.
Tell my wife that I am home and that I sent you. She will tend to your wounds,
I heard him telling Anai.
Tell her what I have told you about the king and that I will be home later. There is much that I need to do.
Anai nodded and half walked, half dragged me to the stair and down off the wall. There were cheers as we staggered past the docks, but I don't think that either of us really registered it at the time. As we made our way numbly through the city, I looked to the sun. It was still an hour till noon. The world as we had known it had come crashing violently down around our ears. Our childhood had ended. We had been in a horrifying battle for our survival, and it wasn't even time for lunch. Terror gripped me as I wondered what the evening would bring. King Iliac was dead, along with nearly all of our army, and the enemy had come to our door with a vengeance. The siege of Katai had begun. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I am the Casual Deathworlder, your host, and this has been Time and Tide, Chapter 2. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed bringing it to you. If you did, please go ahead and smash those like and subscribe buttons and consider dropping us a comment down below. As always, a huge shout out goes to my buddy Gregor for the editing. Thank you very much, buddy. I could never do this without you. Now then, I record this in the hopes that, I might get a little bit better of a reaction than Chapter 1 did. Chapter 1 absolutely tanked as far as the analytics go. Yeah, looks like about the only 3 people who even listened to the whole thing all the way through were the 3 people who actually commented on it. We shall see. That said, with any luck, next week I will have another short story from the Jenkins verse. I'm just waiting for the actual author's permission to present it. Okay, and now for a bit of news. For those of you who have not heard, our buddy Zren has unfortunately recently announced his retirement, so he will not be continuing the story. He will not be continuing his rendition of the Deathworlders, or pretty much anything else for that matter. This, unfortunately, is a tragedy for the HFY community, as Zren was much, much loved. Zren, we respect your decision, but we all miss you and love you. I hope you actually hear this someday. Now then, question, who's got the question? Okay, looking for ideas. I'm looking for a name for a kayak. If you got any ideas, leave your answers in the comments down below. In the meantime, be safe, be well. I love you all. Bye-bye.